Hi, welcome to Round Robin. I'm Celine Guerrero with the City of Hampton, and with us today we have the NASA historian, well, you're a historian liaison, Gail Langevin, and she's here to tell us all about the 100 years of NASA, or sort of, right?
So that's a lot to talk about.
Yes, it is.
So much has happened in the 100 years, but we started in 1917 as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. We were the first civilian research laboratory for aircraft, and that's basically what we did. We looked at aircraft, tried to improve flight, tried to make them safer, and basically we started when aircraft were biplanes, and we moved all the way up into the X-plane era of the late 1950s, where we had the X-15 that flew hypersonically or over Mach 5 and flew at the edge of space.
And that was when that transition from NACA to NASA, what we know now as NASA, happened. Is that correct?
So yes, that happened at the dawn of the space age, and we became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and we looked at putting humans in space.
Yeah, and that was also the whole space race and Project Mercury, which, you know, people are familiar with Mercury and Mercury Boulevard, but, you know, there is a history to that, and please expand on that.
So the Project Mercury was the first space project of the United States, and it started here at NASA Langley. A group of engineers had been looking at high-speed flight. They were called the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division, and they took engineers from that division and a couple of engineers from what was then NASA Lewis,
Okay.
and because they were propulsion experts, and they formed what we call the Space Task Group. And then the Space Task Group developed the entire Mercury program, and that happened right here in Hampton.
That is pretty big. That's big.
Yeah, it was big because it had never been done before.
Right.
So they had to stop and think, how can we make a spacecraft that's safe, that can survive the temperature of reentry, that can support life? They have to carry everything with them because they're in space.
Right.
There's no air, no water, no food. They had to develop the procedures, and back then there wasn't communication satellite everywhere, so you had to develop a tracking and data relay system at different points along the orbits to relay information back to mission control. In fact, mission control had to be developed, so the concept of checking off all your systems before you go into flight, of keeping track of the spacecraft and where it is and the astronauts, all came about through people who worked at Langley.
And what was the outcome of Project Mercury?
So Project Mercury put 6 men in space. The first 2 just went up and came down in a trajectory flight. The third one, John Glenn, was the first American to orbit. So by the time the Mercury program had ended in May of 1963, Gordon Cooper had orbited a grand total of 22 orbits.
Wow. And I know that a lot of us are familiar with the Hidden Figures book and the amazing women who helped a lot in that program.
Indeed. At Langley, back in the NACA days, they began hiring women to do the engineering equation calculations. And in the 50s, they began hiring African American women to also work in this group. Katherine Johnson had worked with some of the men who were assigned to the Space Task Group earlier in her career and in their careers on aircraft research. They moved over to Space Task Group, but she stayed behind in aircraft research. But when it came time for them to find somebody to calculate their equations, they brought their work back to Katherine.
That's so amazing.
It is. It's
I always
very
love
amazing.
hearing that. It's such a neat story.
She was well respected. They respected her talent and her intelligence. And for Alan Shepard's flight, someone had to calculate the trajectory. It had never been done before, so she worked with an engineer named Ted Skopinski. She did all the calculations. They figured out the flight path, and they published it in a technical report. And Katherine Johnson was listed as the co-author on this technical report in 1960.
And that's just so groundbreaking for that time, for women of color. That is just amazing.
Women of
Right.
any nationality. That was a very, very rare instance. So she was truly amazing.
Right, and it just goes back to, I always think like there are so many firsts that NASA Langley was a part of and that they accomplished. Can you go back and tell us, not so much a chronological, but name some of the few firsts for NASA Langley?
So developing the entire space program, the basis of what would become even what we're doing today with the space station, started at Langley. The entire concept had to be developed because it had never been done before. Christopher Kraft, who was born in Phoebus, grew up in Hampton, and attended Virginia Tech, developed the mission control concept of looking at all your systems and your spacecraft, making sure everything was working well, making sure the astronaut was in good health, making sure the weather was good. Right. There was nothing in the range that would prevent you from flying. So that was a first.
Yeah, and during that time, I can just imagine Hampton was a completely different place. And if you could just take us back to what Hampton was like in those days, the excitement just must have been something else.
About 2 weeks after Alan Shepard had just made a trajectory flight, President Kennedy announced that the goal of putting a human on the moon before the end of the decade of the 1960s. And that just electrified not only NASA, but the entire nation.
Oh, yeah.
But also, I think, here in our community, because people here were actually working to make that happen. And there was a sense of being on what President Kennedy called the new frontier. There were going to be new opportunities, new adventures, new accomplishments, and it was all happening here at Langley.
Yeah, and what was the duration of, going back to Project Mercury, what was the duration of that project, and then what did it lead to?
So Project Mercury began just a few months before NASA came about, and it ended in May 15th of 1963 with Gordon Cooper's 22 orbit flight. But when President Kennedy announced that there was going to be a person on the moon, the people at NASA realized, wait, we can't just hop from Mercury, one person, 22 days in space. We have to figure out how to keep people in space for a couple weeks, and maybe 2 or 3 of them at a time. So in order to make that leap, they developed Project Gemini. And Project Gemini looked at keeping people in space for a couple weeks, going to the moon required a modular system. So you'd have a series of different spacecraft, and they would have to come up from the moon and meet with the command module. And this concept was called rendezvous and docking, and it wasn't even sure that this could even be done in space. So Gemini helped to develop that technique, and the people at Langley developed a rendezvous and docking simulator in the ceiling of a hangar. So all of the Gemini astronauts came out and practiced that technique.
So neat. That is really neat. And I'm sure there was also testing that also led to Apollo and testing that was done here.
Right. So for our support of Apollo was mainly in wind tunnels, and we looked at the spacecraft and how it would behave while it was in flight. We looked at the spacecraft and the rocket stack, because that has to go through an atmosphere. And they develop what they call an aerodynamic database. So it tells them when the spacecraft is behaving normally. But also, another thing that a Hampton resident developed was a lunar landing facility.
Oh, wow.
So you can see this huge gantry with Creek Road, but it was developed by Hewitt Phillips, who lived in Hampton at the time, had been working at NASA, really started during the NACA days in World War II. And he developed a system where you could suspend the lunar lander, and the astronauts could practice landing the last 150 feet to the surface of the moon. So 24 Apollo astronauts came to Langley and learned that technique, including Neil Armstrong.
That is so amazing. That is so neat that all this history and the connection that, really the beginning of all this exploration happened here in Hampton, and that 100 years, from 1917 and to now, it's been 100 years of just so much exploration, so many new things. What are your hopes for the next 100 years? I mean, as a historian, where do you see
Well,
it
as a
going?
historian, I know now that the agency is currently working on putting humans on Mars, and I really hope I'm around to see that happen. We plan to do that sometime maybe in the late 2030s, but that's, to me, will be so exciting and probably be just as exciting as seeing the first footsteps of humans on the moon.
Yeah, that is just all very exciting. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
So today, our center focuses on not only space flight, but we still look at aircraft and still trying to work to make things safer. And we recently finished up an aviation safety project that improves the safety of aircraft in flight, but also tries to improve the landing time and arrival times at airport by speeding up or using computers to make it safer.
Yeah, which is all very important and something that we all experience with delays and so on. And that is a very important thing to look into as far as aeronautics go, how to make it safer.
Yes.
Yeah, and people like me who don't like to fly will feel a little bit more at ease. Well, thank you so much, Gail.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and now as far as all the events that are happening during the centennial, what do you hope that people take from visiting and touring the open house, and maybe also the trailer, the traveling trailer? What do you hope that people take from that?
I hope they are inspired by the accomplishments of past NACA and NASA employees, and realize that they too, especially students, that they too can go through school and follow their passion and do something really amazing for themselves and for society.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this generation has just so many opportunities.
Oh yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Gail.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you all for watching. And now we just sit here.